I remember the exact moment the words hit me, sharp and unrelenting. She looked at me with eyes I barely recognized, her tone cold and accusing. "You ruined my childhood," she said, as if those 5 words could erase decades of love, sacrifice, and care. My chest tightened, and for a heartbeat, the world around me seemed to stop. I felt a physical ache, the kind that settles deep in your bones when betrayal cuts through the heart so unexpectedly. I thought back over the years, every decision I had made to build a stable life for her, every sleepless night working extra shifts to ensure she had what I never had, every personal dream I set aside so she could flourish. I had given so much, often quietly, with no expectation of recognition. And yet, here she was, reducing it all to blame, as if the sacrifices meant nothing. The disbelief was overwhelming. I could hardly speak, my mind racing to understand how the child I had raised with patience and devotion could see my actions as ruin rather than protection. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I am 73 now, and these moments cut deeper than they might have years ago. Aging carries a fragility, a heightened awareness that time is limited, and yet the emotional wounds feel just as raw. The weight of her accusation pressed down on me, compounded by the knowledge that this was not a passing comment, but a deeply held conviction she had harbored. I sat in silence for a long moment, trying to steady my shaking hands, trying to absorb the magnitude of what had just been said. Anger and sorrow collided inside me. Anger at the injustice of being misunderstood, sorrow for the child who had carried resentment silently for so long. I recalled countless instances where I had chosen to endure hardship so she could have stability, moving towns for her schooling, missing social opportunities to save money for her education, sacrificing my health for the household's well-being. All of it, it seemed, had been invisible to her eyes, overshadowed by a narrative I could not reach. The heartbreak was profound, a sharp contrast to the quiet pride I had once felt in raising her. Even as my thoughts spiraled, a sliver of reflection emerged. I recognized that words spoken in pain often do not capture the whole truth. Yet, the sting remained. How does a parent reconcile decades of devotion with the sudden, cutting dismissal of a life built entirely around love and sacrifice? How do you confront the child who sees only what was denied, not what was given? The questions lingered in the empty space around me, heavy and unrelenting. I felt the ache of vulnerability more keenly than ever. I had spent my life ensuring she would never feel the deprivation I endured. Yet in this moment, I felt exposed and unprotected, as though all my efforts had been for naught. And still, amid the shock, a quiet determination arose. I would not allow this moment to define the entirety of our relationship, nor would I dismiss the pain behind her words. There was work to be done, to understand, to reflect, and to confront the truths we both carried in our hearts. Have you ever felt your sacrifices went unrecognized? I ask you now, because I have. And in this question lies the weight of every parent who has given endlessly, hoping only for acknowledgement, not blame. The hurt is real, the heartbreak profound, and yet the path forward demands both courage and quiet resolve. I sat there, holding on to the remnants of my shock, knowing that the journey to understanding had only just begun, and that every memory, every sacrifice, would need to be examined in the light of her words. I find myself returning again and again to the memories of her childhood, trying to reconcile the life I built for her with the words she hurled at me. I think about the small apartment we lived in when she was 5, the evenings I spent working double shifts so she could attend dance lessons, the summers I skipped vacations so she could experience trips I had never known. Every sacrifice I made, every personal dream I postponed, was done quietly, without complaint. For her sake, I gave her comfort, opportunity, and stability, believing that love measured in action could never be questioned. And yet, as I reflect, I recall her own perspective. Though I cannot know it fully, I can sense it in fleeting moments. The nights she cried herself to sleep over playground disputes I could not attend. The mornings she looked at me with unspoken dissatisfaction when I could not attend school events because of work. She carried feelings I had not anticipated, small seeds of misunderstanding planted unintentionally. I see now how those tiny frustrations may have grown into the resentments that later became words sharp enough to wound me deeply. I remember the sacrifices in concrete ways. The tuition I worked late nights to cover, the time I gave up with friends to coach her soccer team, the evenings spent helping with homework I barely understood myself. All these actions were made with her happiness in mind, yet I never paused to consider how they might be perceived. Did she notice the absence more than the presence of care? Did she measure the life she had by what she thought was denied rather than what she had been given? The questions haunt me, layering sadness over the sense of betrayal. Even as I ponder these moments, I see the subtle signs of early resentment in her behavior, the sharpness of her tone when I offered guidance, the small withdrawals when praise was scarce, the impatient sighs when I tried to engage. At the time, I attributed them to youthful mood swings, normal growing pains. But now, each memory resonates differently. I understand that she may have felt misunderstood or overlooked, that the foundation I believed secure was perceived as constraining, a life carefully built that she had not asked for and did not fully appreciate. Acknowledging what was lost to provide for her, my time, my social life, my energy, even my own health, is painful. It was never done for recognition. Yet recognition was all I ever hoped for. The knowledge that my efforts mattered, that the child I raised knew I had fought to give her a better life than I had. The absence of that acknowledgement has left a lingering ache, a mix of sorrow and moral weight that I carry silently. And now, with her accusation echoing in my mind, I see the early seeds of betrayal. They were not malicious at first, merely misunderstandings, perceptions shaped by limited awareness. But they grew into something tangible, something that cut deeply. The juxtaposition of her childhood experiences with my sacrifices illuminates the tragedy. A life of devotion met with rejection, a foundation of love perceived as neglect. The contrast is stark, and the injustice undeniable. Do you think children understand the sacrifices of their parents? I ask this because, even with all my reflection, the question remains. I did everything I could for her, yet the result was heartbreak. The sadness lingers, the empathy for her perspective deepens, and the awareness of the injustice settles heavily in my chest. Every memory, every action, every sacrifice now carries both pride and sorrow, and the journey to reconcile them has only just begun. Over the months, I began to notice the subtle ways she pulled away. It started with her eyes avoiding mine, quick glances that flickered away whenever I entered the room. Phone calls grew shorter, messages unanswered, casual texts ignored. Each small act of avoidance felt like a quiet chisel, carving distance between. I tried to rationalize it at first. Perhaps she was busy, distracted by work, or overwhelmed by her own life. But the pattern was unmistakable, persistent, and increasingly painful. I recalled moments when her tone carried a slight edge I had not anticipated. Little criticisms, fleeting sighs, or hesitant replies that I had brushed off as adolescent moodiness now seemed laden with unspoken grievance. Each interaction, once filled with warmth and laughter, was now tinged with tension. I began to sense that her perception of my choices, decisions made to ensure family stability, had shifted. Where I had thought to provide safety, guidance, and structure, she seemed to see only restriction, control, or lack of understanding. The first serious conflict emerged around choices I had made to secure our household. I remember the day clearly, a discussion over financial decisions I had implemented to protect her future. She reacted with frustration, questioning my motives and casting doubt on my intentions. I was stunned by the intensity of her response, the disbelief that the sacrifices I had made could be interpreted as harmful. That moment planted a seed of fear in me, fear that my efforts to safeguard her life were being misread as harm or neglect. Internally, I wrestled with guilt. Had I erred in my approach? Had I misjudged the balance between guidance and control? At the same time, I felt a strong sense of responsibility to maintain the structures I had built, to uphold the promises I had made to ensure her well-being. The tension between guilt and duty gnawed at me, leaving me exhausted yet unwilling to step back from what I knew was right. With each passing day, the distance became more pronounced. I began to notice that her avoidance was not accidental. There was intent behind it. She had started to withdraw before conflicts arose, retreating quietly from connection, her smiles rarer, her responses more guarded. It became clear that the estrangement was deliberate, a protective wall she had erected between us. That realization filled me with helplessness, tempered by a quiet, urgent concern for her emotional and moral well-being. I replayed countless interactions in my mind, searching for moments where I might have faltered, yet I could not find a single act of cruelty or neglect that warranted this level of withdrawal. And still, the wall remained. Each unanswered call, each avoided conversation, each subtle dismissal reinforced the painful truth. She was pulling away, intentionally, and I could not force her back without risking further harm. What would you do if your child refused to acknowledge your sacrifices? I ask this because it is a question that has haunted me daily. The helplessness, the fear, and the moral responsibility intertwine, creating a tension that is difficult to endure. And yet, even in this growing distance, I find that my resolve to understand, to protect, and to bridge the gap remains steadfast, no matter how much the path ahead challenges my heart. A thick envelope arrived one morning, resting against the edge of my mailbox. The handwriting was neat, unfamiliar, and immediately caught my attention. Inside was a letter from someone named Julia, a reporter who claimed to have observed my daughter in ways I could not. I unfolded the paper slowly, feeling a mixture of unease and cautious curiosity. Her words were careful, precise, yet beneath the surface ran a current of concern that made my chest tighten. She described behaviors I had barely noticed, patterns that spoke of fear, secrecy, and mounting stress. Julia detailed the subtle signs of my daughter's struggle, how she had begun avoiding casual interactions, how her posture stiffened in social settings, how she seemed tense when discussing school, work, or family. She noted moments when my daughter appeared anxious, withdrawn, or hesitant to engage, behaviors I had dismissed or rationalized as normal adulthood stress. Reading it, I realized that someone else had been watching, noticing the strain that had gone unnoticed in my own home, validating fears I had barely acknowledged myself. The letter provided a timeline that clarified many gaps in my understanding. Julia had observed my daughter's avoidance over the past several months, noting when calls went unanswered, when invitations to family gatherings were declined, and when sudden mood shifts occurred. The patterns she outlined made a chilling kind of sense. The estrangement was not random, but consistent, growing slowly, almost imperceptibly, until the distance had become undeniable. Each date, each observation, added pressure to my growing concern. I could feel both relief and sorrow pressing against me simultaneously. Relief that someone else had noticed what I had struggled to name. Sorrow at the realization that my daughter had carried so much tension in isolation. Julia's observations suggested the influence of external pressures on my daughter's perception of her childhood. She hinted that supervisors, peers, or other adults in her life might be framing her experiences in ways that caused her to misinterpret my sacrifices as harm or neglect. The thought was unsettling. My mind raced with questions. Was she being misled? Was someone exploiting her trust or framing her reality? The unease settled deep in my chest, gnawing at the sense of security I had once felt in our relationship. I grappled with conflicting emotions as I folded the letter. Relief that someone outside our family understood enough to warn me. Sorrow for the child I had raised, who now seemed so burdened and misunderstood. Concern that her perspective was being shaped by forces beyond her awareness. These feelings collided, leaving me exhausted yet resolute. I knew I had to tread carefully, to listen, to observe, and to protect her, even as I struggled to untangle the layers of influence and misunderstanding. Would you trust a stranger trying to explain your child's behavior? I asked myself that question over and over, knowing that I had little choice but to place some faith in Julia's observations. Her insight offered a lifeline, a thread I could follow to understand the growing rift between us. But along with that lifeline came responsibility, to act wisely, to safeguard my daughter, and to confront the realities I had long avoided. The unease lingered, heavy and pressing, as I set the letter down and considered the steps I would need to take next. As I sifted through the memories and recent observations, the picture of my daughter's hidden burdens began to clarify. It was not just a matter of perception. There were tangible pressures shaping her response to my sacrifices. I recalled the long hours I spent working extra shifts, the personal opportunities I let pass, and the financial compromises I had made to provide stability. Each of these actions, intended to secure her future, now appeared to her as constraints, restrictions, or lost freedoms. The weight of realization pressed heavily on me, mingling sorrow with a gnawing sense of moral urgency. I remembered specific moments. The summer she wanted to attend a special program, and I could not afford it without cutting essential household needs. The evenings I missed school events to handle work obligations, the weekends spent managing finances instead of attending family outings. Every decision had been deliberate, driven by care and necessity, yet each may have been perceived as neglect or denial. It struck me that the very efforts meant to build her happiness had, in some ways, become sources of tension and misunderstanding. Julia's observations became crucial at this point. Her letters corroborated my reflections, detailing how these pressures may have been internalized by my daughter, how her stress, secrecy, and subtle frustration could be traced to both my actions and external influences in her own life. The convergence of financial strain, emotional expectation, and miscommunication had created a complicated web, leaving my daughter feeling trapped between gratitude and resentment. It was heartbreaking to see how intention and perception had diverged so drastically, creating rifts neither of us had anticipated. As I reviewed each incident, I felt rising fear, not just for my daughter's emotional well-being, but for the consequences that might follow if this misunderstanding continued unchecked. Her resentment, though unspoken, was tangible. It had begun to shape her interactions, her choices, and her perception of our shared past. I grappled with anger at the circumstances that had contributed to this misunderstanding, moral outrage at the unintended harm that had arisen from my sacrifices, and protective instincts that urged me to find a way to bridge the growing gap. At the same time, I wrestled with grief. I wanted to defend my actions, to explain the sacrifices made quietly and intentionally, yet I feared that doing so might seem defensive or dismissive of her feelings. The tension between wanting to protect her from further pain and acknowledging the very real hurt she felt was almost unbearable. I recognized that the path forward required patience, reflection, and careful navigation of emotions, both hers and mine. Each new realization added weight, building a sense of urgency tempered by the need for care. The financial, emotional, and logistical strains, combined with the corroboration from Julia's outside perspective, made it clear that this was more than simple misunderstanding. It was a cumulative effect of choices made in love, interpreted through the lens of her own experiences and pressures. Would you confront your child directly or try to gather more understanding first? I asked myself, knowing that each option carried risks. Acting too quickly could deepen the rift, while waiting could allow resentment to fester. The complexity of love, sacrifice, and misunderstanding pressed on me, shaping every thought and every decision I contemplated. Even in the quiet of reflection, the burden of responsibility remained, demanding measured action, empathy, and unwavering resolve. I knew I could not let the tension fester any longer. The distance, the resentment, and the unspoken frustrations had grown too heavy to ignore. I arranged a meeting with a family counselor, someone trained to navigate the fragile spaces between love and conflict. Sitting in the softly lit office, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. This was the first step toward addressing the emotional fallout that had settled between us, a step toward understanding without judgment. The conversation began cautiously. I spoke of my sacrifices, the long hours worked to provide stability, the nights spent managing finances instead of sharing leisure time, the personal opportunities I had set aside so she could thrive. I tried to articulate these choices without casting blame, hoping that clarity might illuminate my intentions. The counselor listened carefully, nodding, offering occasional guidance to help structure the dialogue. For a moment, there was hope that the walls between us could be bridged, but my daughter was defensive. She bristled at reminders of the past, her responses sharp, her posture rigid. Each word I offered was met with hesitation or contradiction, and the air between us grew tense. I felt the weight of her mistrust pressing down on me, mingling with my own sorrow and fatigue. The counselor encouraged patience, reminding me that these conversations often unearthed years of misperception and emotion. Still, the sting of misunderstanding was unmistakable, a constant reminder that love alone could not resolve accumulated hurt. I wrestled internally with conflicting feelings. I wanted to defend my actions, to explain the choices made for her benefit. Yet I feared that doing so might feel like self-justification and further alienate her. At the same time, I recognized my responsibility to maintain my own dignity and emotional well-being. Protecting her from additional pain had to be balanced with asserting the truth of my intentions and boundaries. The counselor's calm presence helped me navigate this tension, yet the weight of decision remained entirely on my shoulders. As the session progressed, I realized that establishing clear boundaries was essential, not as punishment, but as a safeguard for both of us. The sacrifices I had made were real and meaningful, and they deserved acknowledgement, even if imperfectly understood. By defining what could be tolerated and what could not, I could protect my own emotional health while still offering guidance and support. It was a delicate balance, a moral reckoning that required honesty, restraint, and unwavering resolve. By the end of the meeting, a cautious hope lingered. We had spoken, even if not fully understood, and a path forward had begun to emerge. Yet the fear remained, fear that the misunderstandings could reignite, that the wounds of misperception could deepen. I left the office carrying both the weight of grief and a sense of measured progress. The journey toward reconciliation, or at least mutual understanding, would be long, but I knew that establishing boundaries and seeking clarity was not betrayal. It was protection, both for her and for myself, and a step toward healing that had been long overdue. Is it betrayal to set boundaries with a child, or protection? I asked myself, feeling the tension of that question settle in my chest. In seeking understanding, I had also begun to assert the dignity that long years of devotion deserved, a delicate act of love and responsibility that would shape every step forward. The message arrived quietly, a text that seemed almost tentative in its tone. I held my breath as I read the first few words, each one weighted with the tension of weeks of silence and distance. She admitted, plainly and painfully, that she had misunderstood the sacrifices I had made for her. Guilt and shame threaded through every sentence, an acknowledgement that her anger had grown from a perception shaped by fear, frustration, and miscommunication. My chest tightened as I absorbed the depth of her admission. She went on to explain the pressures that had influenced her perspective. Friends, colleagues, and even well-meaning adults had framed her childhood and my choices in ways that made her doubt my intentions. Each external voice had added a layer of confusion and resentment, creating a distorted narrative in her mind. I could feel the heartbreak settle deeper with each revelation, not only for the child I had raised, but for the subtle, unseen forces that had manipulated her perception of love and sacrifice. As I read, I confronted the reality I had been resisting. The betrayal was real, yet it was partially fueled by perception rather than deliberate intent. My daughter had acted out of misunderstanding, shaped by influences beyond her control, yet the pain inflicted was undeniable. I felt sorrow, yes, but also a rising moral clarity. I could separate the actions from the intent, understand the distortion without excusing the hurt, and see both the fragility and strength in her choices. The emotional climax hit me fully as I reflected on the years of parenting, of sacrifice, of quiet devotion that had been misinterpreted. Heartbreak washed over me, tempered by the realization that moral clarity did not require condoning the pain caused. I could grieve for the wounds, acknowledge the loss of connection, and still hold to the truth of my actions and intentions. The complexity of love, perception, and external influence weighed heavily, yet the clarity it brought allowed me to see the situation in full measure. Internal reflection became unavoidable. I thought about the limits of parental influence, the impossibility of controlling another person's perceptions, and the moral responsibility to guide without coercion. My sacrifices had been real and deliberate, yet I could not force her to recognize them. I could offer guidance, structure, and support, but ultimately, her understanding was shaped by her own experiences and the pressures of the world around her. I wrestled with the balance of sorrow and insight, of empathy and justice. The heartbreak remained, profound and persistent, but it was now tempered with understanding. I recognized the tangled web of love and resentment, of intention and perception, and the delicate truth that moral clarity could coexist with lingering grief. What consequence feels fair for someone torn between love and resentment? I asked myself. knowing that the answer was neither simple nor singular. It required reflection, judgment, and a steady heart, qualities I was still cultivating, even as the weight of the past pressed on me. And in that quiet reckoning, I began to see the path forward, one defined by responsibility, care, and the limits of influence, no matter how painful the lessons. I sit quietly now, long after the arguments, the misunderstandings, and the revelation. The house is still, the air heavy with the echoes of conversation that can never be fully recaptured. I think about the years I spent making sacrifices, the nights I stayed awake worrying, the moments I set aside my own needs so she could have stability, opportunity, and care. I gave all I could, and yet her perception has been shaped not only by my actions, but by her own experiences, misunderstandings, and the pressures she carried. There is sorrow in acknowledging the gap between intention and perception. I grieve the lost moments, the unrecognized efforts, and the emotional distance that grew despite all my striving. Yet alongside that sorrow is a quiet strength, the knowledge that I acted with love, integrity, and purpose. I cannot undo the past, nor can I fully control how she interprets it, but I can own my actions, my choices, and the devotion that guided them. Reflecting on these years, I see lessons etched deeply into every interaction. Communication must be clear and ongoing. Understanding must be sought patiently. Parenting has limits, and even the most devoted efforts cannot guarantee appreciation or recognition. There is wisdom in these reflections, but it comes tempered by the pain of realizing that love alone cannot shield against misunderstanding or resentment. I consider now the question of reconciliation versus distance. To reach out again cautiously might invite connection, yet it carries risk that old misunderstandings could reopen, that further resentment could fester. To maintain distance might protect both of us from additional hurt, but it also locks away any possibility of closeness, leaving only memory and reflection. There is no easy answer, no definitive path to resolution. The moral weight of these choices rests entirely on my shoulders, a quiet but persistent burden. Even as I ponder these questions, I acknowledge the love that endures despite pain. My heart still carries affection, care, and a longing for understanding, even when recognition is absent. The heartbreak is real and unrelenting, but it exists alongside personal growth, the knowledge that I acted with intention, courage, and commitment. That duality is a part of aging, a part of parenthood, and a part of living through betrayal without letting it define the totality of my life. Was justice in understanding and setting boundaries enough, or would I close the door forever? I do not yet know. The answer is unsettled, like the quiet in the rooms of this house. I am left with reflection, regret, and a steadying sense of quiet strength, aware that some questions may remain unresolved, some wounds may never fully heal. Yet within that unresolved space, there is clarity about who I am, what I have done, and the limits of love and influence. I carry forward, not with resolution of all pain, but with acknowledgement of the truth, the sacrifices, and the lessons. The path ahead is measured, deliberate, and cautious, shaped by reflection, moral clarity, and the enduring weight of love, tempered by heartbreak. In this quiet, I find strength, even as the echoes of the past linger, unresolved and profound.